All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Arik Burakovsky, and I manage the Russia and Eurasia Program here at Fletcher. I'm honored to welcome you to this panel discussion on the international security lessons of the war in Ukraine. This event is part of a series of conversations, the last one about the war in Ukraine that we've organized in collaboration with the Fletcher and Harvard alumni clubs in Ukraine. I am delighted to introduce our moderator today, Professor Richard Schultz. He is the Shelby Collum Davis Professor of International Security Studies and Director of the International Security Studies Program at Fletcher. Professor Schultz, let me turn it over to you to introduce our three distinguished panelists, and after that, we will start the conversation.
Well, we have a very important topic in front of us, and we have three individuals in Ariel Cohen and Mike Pesner and Bob Bell, who are more than equipped to address this issue we face. What I'd like to do is just start with Ariel. And what I've done is I've written down a question that I'll ask each of them after they make their remarks. And we'll move through our three speakers. And then, Arik, you're going to field questions from those who are attending. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
So, Ariel, I first met you in the late 80s. And you were a doctoral student when the world changed. We remember those days well. So why don't you tell us about your views on Western military assistance to the Ukraine, and fold into it the dangers of escalation.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you, Arik, for coordinating this. I am absolutely delighted to be on a panel moderated by my mentor, Professor Richard Schultz, whom I fondly remember and am eternally grateful for his teaching and support during my time at Fletcher. Before I address the two questions by the moderator, I want to take a step back and say that, number one, the war in Ukraine is not about Ukraine. It is about how Russia perceives itself. It is about Russia's place in Europe. And it's about Russia's place in the world in the balance of power between what they perceive as 3.5 poles of this world: Russia, China, the United States, and Europe being half of a pole because it's still lacking the military component to speak of. Secondly, it's about the vision of the Russian Empire, the vision that is extant for hundreds of years, starting with the 17th century, pre-Peter the Great, pre-Westernization, the concept of Russia, the Third Rome, Russia as the true locus of Christianity after the collapse of Byzantium, the denial and denigration of the Catholic and later Protestant West, and the view of Russia as an imperial entity. At this stage, the paramount goal is to consolidate what I call the East Slavic core. The East Slavic core, of course, includes Ukraine and Belarus, but please note that in the Russian government rhetoric, the ideologues of the government and Putin himself, the existence of Ukraine as a country and the existence of Ukrainians as people is denied. This is, I call it, preparatory to genocidal. If you deny statehood, you deny peoplehood. The next logical step is to destroy the people, and we see already elements of that being in place in Eastern Ukraine. Secondly, and I'll put this squarely on the doorstep of the collective West, of Europe and the United States. We collectively ignored the warning signs of Russia gearing up for the next step of imperial expansion. I maintain my count from 2007. There were early warnings even before that. On my trips to Moscow, I was already picking up a lot of chatter and was following Alexander Dugin closely and others who are less well known. But 2007, Putin's Munich speech, 2008, invasion of Georgia. I write articles and reports at the Heritage Foundation at the time saying that Ukraine is next, the Crimea is next. Giving out citizenship as candy is one of the Sudetenland style tools of Russian imperialism. We keep ignoring that all the way into 2014, the Russian invasion, annexation, occupation and annexation of the Crimea and the war in Donbass. The Obama administration is very, very cautious not to give any quote unquote lethal aid to Ukraine. The Trump administration starts giving them javelins, but not much more. To our credit and to the Ukrainians' credit, there were lessons learned from the Donbass war and some training. With the beginning of the current round of warfare, which I predicted and had a piece in The Hill, January 6th, again, outlining the strategic big picture for Russia, pushing the US out of Europe militarily. This December 17 declaration by the Russian Federation with a list of demands that they knew all along that the US and the West are not going to comply with. NATO back to the borders of 1997, Ukraine neutral, limitations for the long-range weapons to be deployed in the airspace or in the oceans around Russia, unacceptable demands that led to this war for reasons I already mentioned. In terms of the current supplies, I think we're doing better than I expected. In terms of Ukrainian resistance, I think Ukrainians are heroes. Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava, glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes, the old nationalist slogan. I fully subscribe to it today. And the heroism of the Ukrainian resistance is for the books, as well as the prevalence and the victories of light infantry with ample anti-tank weaponry over heavy mechanized infantry and armor of the Russian Federation. However, the Russian GDP is 10 times bigger than Ukraine's. We understand that the Russians think today that they're going to win the long war, the war of attrition. Whether they're going to do it or not depends on us, depends on the West. The Western GDP is 12 times bigger, at least 12 times bigger. Maybe, no, it's more than that. 2 trillion, 23 times bigger than combined EU and the US, not counting Japan, South Korea, Australia, and others. So in the long run, I'm not so sure the Russians are going to win if we maintain our resolve. Last week, I was a part of a high-level US-German group called the Loisach Group, run out of the Marshall Center by Andrew Michta, whom I'm sure Dick knows. For the first time in years, we heard our German colleagues being on message, on target, saying, yes, we're not breaking ranks, but what about you? What happens if Republicans win? What happens if Trump comes back in 24? Are you going to stick to this strategic course? So I think we are tiptoeing a fine line between triggering the Russian nuclear escalation and providing ample supply to the Ukrainians. I hope, and I'm looking forward to hear from our Ukrainian colleague, I hope that as this round of Russian offensive exhausts itself, there will be a significant Ukrainian counterattack leading to at least the return of the Ukrainian forces to the borders of February 23 and maybe beyond into Donbass. I do believe that the Crimea, my birthplace, guilty as charged, may be a red line at which Putin will consider using the nuke. I'm wrapping it up. And of course, using of TAC nukes is the big, big threat and a game changer. The question is, and I discussed it for hours with many colleagues, okay, so he shoots one nuke. What happens next? Do we retaliate? Do we continue? Does it scare us? Does it scare the Europeans? I think the jury is out. We really do not know. There is, as Richard Schultz told us, the fog of war, quoting Clausewitz. We do not know what will happen next.
Ariel, I had one question for you, and I'm going to ask it, but I would like you to keep the answer brief.
Yes, sir.
Were you surprised by the performance of the Russian army? Now, recently, I wrote a piece which I titled Russia's Potemkin Army. And I wonder to what extent you were surprised by their lack of performance.
In the initial stages of the war, I was surprised. It was the elements that were thrown into the war were Potemkin, were sham. They threw in very unprepared recruits. We also saw, interestingly enough, fits the imperial model, they threw the non-ethnic Russian elements such as the Chechens, the Buryats, and now there's a video of Africans, some African mercenaries marching in unknown Ukrainian or possibly Russian city. But I think they're getting better. There are many reports of the Russians just pushing and pushing relentlessly, especially in the Donbass. And yeah, I was surprised, but the famous saying is Russia is never as weak or as strong as it seems, and this may be the case as well.
Thank you. Mike, why don't we go to you?
Great. Well, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, terrific. Well, good afternoon, and thank you to Fletcher for hosting this. Dr. Schultz, great to see you, and thank you for moderating. And Arik, thank you for organizing. And I wanted to also mention Oleg, who is in Ukraine. And of course, to all of the alumni and students who are joining us today. I think our bios were provided, but I wanted to say that I work for Chairman Mark Warner of the Senate Intelligence Committee, but I'm appearing here in my own personal capacity. So just as a small caveat, all opinions are my own and should not be ascribed to him or to other committee members. So very briefly, I think we're in actually day 99 of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And of course, that goes back to the Napoleonic days when he had his 100 days between the return from Elba and Waterloo, and certainly accomplished much, but ultimately went down in defeat. And of course, we've seen a lot of, I think, assumptions that may have been shattered in these first 3+ months of the war, from how I think most folks predicted that it was going to go down in about 2 to 3 to 5 days between the invasion and when the Russians would be parading down the Khreshchatyk in Kiev. That certainly has not happened. We've seen remarkable, and I'm going to echo some of the points that Ariel made, and just wanted to say hi as well to Ariel. Good to see you. Remarkable and widely unexpected resistance by the Ukrainians, from the professional army to the volunteers. And you've also seen, I think, a lot of myths shattered in terms of the unprecedented US assistance, both military and non-military, as well as the European assistance to Ukraine that we've seen. And we certainly are today, 3 months in, a long way from where I think folks expected to be when the invasion started, in terms of how provocative this military assistance and how escalatory it was deemed to be before the invasion. And just, I'm sure folks are following this, but I just jotted down some notes. So yesterday, President Biden approved the 11th drawdown authority in terms of security assistance. And so the overall numbers are $5.3 billion in military and security assistance that the Biden administration alone has provided, and 4.6 of that has been since February 24th. And then, of course, overall, since the invasion of Crimea and the Donbass in 2014, 7.3 billion has been provided just by the US. You add on to that about, again, public figures, 2.1 billion in EU military support, something I never thought that we would see. Obviously, that includes Germany, which initially was providing just helmets. The UK has provided 2 billion, and that includes, tanks, heavy artillery, anti-ship systems, going down the list. The latest US assistance, of course, if you've been following the news, includes these long-range artillery pieces, HIMARS, but the Biden administration has limited the ammunition it provides so that it will not extend past, I believe, 50 miles, as opposed to the longer range rockets, which can reach as much as 200 miles. And that, of course, doesn't include the 155 millimeter artillery pieces that we've now started providing, the thousands and thousands of Javelin anti-tank missiles, the thousands and thousands of anti-aircraft systems, Stingers and others, and you just go down and down and down the list. Very heavy support by the United States and NATO. And of course, this has had bipartisan support here on the Hill. We just saw the latest assistance package of $40 billion that was passed on an overwhelmingly bipartisan basis and signed by the president, I guess it was earlier this week. And that is on top of the 13.6 billion previously provided. And so this is really unprecedented. And of course, I'm gonna just skip over this because I was gonna make some points about how the Russian army really has been underperforming. And this has been very much, I think, unexpected, including by our intelligence folks. Unprofessional, they've lost as much as a third of their personnel, a quarter of their tanks. They've committed atrocities. They're suffering from poor leadership, no unity of command, kind of basic military principles with their seven-pronged invasion, the lack of NCOs, the lack of communications, resorting to cell phones, which can be targeted and intercepted. Oleg probably can talk a little bit about this. And of course, this has been somewhat a surprise because we saw the Georgian invasion in 2008, where some of the tanks had to be towed. And really there was an effort under the defense minister then to reform the Russian military. We saw some of these reforms in Crimea in 2014, right? Taken without a shot fired. You saw the hybrid warfare in the Donbass. You saw the election interference. You saw the Russian deploying for the first time out of area to Syria. And of course, I think a lot of this took a lot of people by surprise because they performed very well. But again, if you look at it, it was only about 5% of the force that they sent to Syria. And when clearly they've not been able to scale this up. So I'm actually going to ask some questions that I hope that we can get into, because these have been on my mind, I think a lot of other people's minds. And, as I said, there's overwhelming bipartisan support on the Hill, Democrat and Republican, with some outliers in providing Ukraine. If you remember those old World War II posters, we give them the arms and they finish the job. Well, my question is, what is that job? In other words, how does this end? And I think, Dr. Schultz, you alluded to it in terms of the risks of escalation. We've seen the diplomatic efforts peter out. Initially, you saw Zelensky talk about being open to now sort of neutrality for Ukraine if there could be security guarantees provided. I haven't heard that in probably weeks or months. And of course, the territorial gains that the Russians incompetently, with atrocities and targeting the civilians and just kind of flattening cities with their artillery warfare, which is reminiscent of what we saw in Chechnya, have now really expanded, and they now have that land corridor from the Donbass to the Crimea. They have the water supply that they wanted to around Kherson from the Dnipro to be able to supply Crimea, which the Ukrainians had previously cut off and was a weak point for the Russian occupation there. And it's really unclear to me that at this point in the war, even with the kind of incremental gains and then some setbacks around Kharkiv for the Russians, that Zelensky and the Ukrainian government would be prepared for any kind of diplomatic deal that allows the Russians to keep that territory. And so it's not clear what the parameters of a possible solution might be. Okay, so if there is no agreement, second question, what happens if there's no agreement? Our stated goals of the United States are, we will help Ukraine attain victory. Now, what that is has not been defined. I think there's been some attempts around the edges to say democratic, free Ukraine within its borders that is able to maintain independence and defense from a future Russian invasion. And the flip side of the coin, that the Russian military will be weakened to such an extent that it will not be able to repeat this type of invasion in the future. We've seen, and deservedly so, condemnation of Putin and his regime as war criminals. But this leads to the escalation question. This is one I don't have a good answer to, and I hope that we can discuss, which is the view from the Kremlin is very different from the view in Washington, the view in Brussels, the view in Kiev. I would say, and I haven't heard anything different on this, that this is not just propaganda that the Russians are spinning, that Putin and the gang around him really do see Ukraine in NATO as an existential threat to the Russian state and to the Putin regime. Now, if you posit all those things, and I haven't seen anyone who says that that's not the case, if those are the things, and if I'm going to say our, meaning US and NATO, stated goals are that Putin will not achieve his goals in Ukraine, which is the neutralization, the inability to join NATO or European security and governance structures, and a limit on Ukraine's military. If our goal is really to prevent Putin from achieving his goals, and there is no chance, or very little chance, I don't think anybody knows what's in Putin's head, but I haven't seen any argument that he's going to change those goals, that leads to the question of what victory looks like. Because if the Russian conventional military is no longer able to fulfill the goals that Putin sets for it, and I think we're getting close to that point. We're not there yet. They're still making gains, hard fought, and with the blood of Ukrainian men and women, both military and civilian. But if he cannot attain those goals that he has set for the conventional military, the only step that I see taking place is that he will not change those goals. He may change some tactics, right? Kiev is no longer in his sights. Kharkiv is no longer in his sights. But if he doesn't change those fundamental goals, that means that he is more likely to change the means rather than the goals. And if we see that this is such an existential threat, at least in the viewpoint of the Kremlin, we're going to see some sort of escalation. The question is, why haven't we seen one to begin with? This is something that my boss, Senator Warner, has asked. Why haven't we seen, we've seen all these vaunted cyber capabilities. Nobody says that they're just a Potemkin cyber capability, right? We saw the Colonial Pipeline go down. We've seen the use of cyber in Ukraine. Why haven't we seen crippling attacks against our infrastructure, the Europeans? Question. There are other capabilities. We saw the Russians take out a satellite system right before this whole thing started, or a satellite. That is an asymmetric capability, some would argue, that the United States is overly dependent on and could be something for the Russians to potentially target if they want to escalate asymmetrically. ChemBio, they have plenty of capabilities. We've seen some reports nothing credible that I've seen that actually you've had a serious chemical attack. Some riot control agents, I think, is what I've seen. And then down to what Ariel mentioned, nuclear escalation. And I would say that, I'll probably end on this because I've gone on too long, but I would say that this is really something that concerns me, because I think we've come to think of nuclear as, the what Frederick the Great used to call the final argument of kings, the ultima ratio regio. In other words, that is the final argument of Putin or a regime like his. And that if he sets off a tactical nuclear weapon somewhere in Ukraine, we've seen President Biden comment on this, that this would be unacceptable to us and would carry severe consequences. I'm paraphrasing the president's letter. But it's not clear to me that this is how this is viewed in the Kremlin. I think they make a distinction between tactical and strategic nuclear. They make a distinction between strikes within NATO territory and outside of NATO territory. And Ukraine, unfortunately, in the view of some, is not within NATO territory, doesn't fall under Article 5. And there may be a miscalculation that if the army is collapsing, if they believe that they're about to lose the war, that they will, and we're a long way from there. But I'm just talking about down the road, that the risk of that escalation, the longer this goes on, the worse the Russian army does conventionally, that we cannot rule this out. And unfortunately, that is a very dangerous scenario where something like that is possible. And it's not clear to me what those severe consequences that the president has talked about really are, because I don't know that this administration or any other one, frankly, or the American people or the Europeans are ready to go to full DEFCON 1 nuclear war, World War III, if there is the use of a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. This is a Fletcher crew, so these are some tough questions. And just the last couple of points is that I think you're right. There is a clock ticking, Ariel, but we've seen Russia's economy go down about 10% because of the sanctions. Ukraine's economy is down about 50%, if not more, according to some of the estimates that I've seen. And then you have these second and third order effects. The food and commodity prices are up by a third. You have the real danger of starvation, and that means instability in parts of the globe, Middle East, Africa. And once that happens, you're already kind of seeing Ukraine, unfortunately, go down a little bit from, the front page to now maybe the lower half of the newspaper. These shooting tragedies around the US have kicked it off CNN to some extent, the Supreme Court decision. And the longer this goes on, my worry is precisely the point that some of those German interlocutors made to you, Ariel, which is, we have a short attention span here in the Western democracies. We saw that in Afghanistan, we saw that in Somalia. And when this is no longer front and center, I'm afraid that this can get into this grinding stalemate that will simply bleed Ukraine dry. Now, obviously, it's bleeding the Russian army as well, but it's an open question as to where the clock is ticking longer. Is it in Washington? Is it in Moscow? Is it in Kiev? Some other factors. Of course, China's watching this in relation to how they view Taiwan. And this is a fine line that this administration needs to tread between providing the weapons to ensure that aggression is not punished, to help a democratic Ukraine that we hope emerges in the future, but do it in such a way that we don't trigger this kind of escalation to nuclear Armageddon. And we saw this, I think, most aptly in this latest transfer of the HIMARS with the shorter range artillery. Is it defensive? Is it offensive? How is it used? There's a lot of questions. There's the fog of war, I think, as was alluded to. And I unfortunately have more questions than answers. And thank you so much for having me today.
Mike, the one thing I have been thinking about, though, is the remark that Secretary of Defense Austin made about what he sees as the goal for the outcome of the war, which is that we want to see Russia weakened. I read that as no more Ukraines, and not just containment, but almost an isolation and turning Russia into a a global outcast. So he's put down, I think, a pretty strong position on this. Now the administration backed away on his remarks, but it seems to me that there are those inside the Biden government, and especially Secretary of Defense Austin, who has a view of the day after that's pretty harsh in terms of how Russia is contained. But I'll stop with that, and we'll go to Bob Bell, who knows more about NATO than anyone I know. And Bob, in addressing NATO, I wonder if you have any thoughts about what might be NATO's new strategic concept. That NATO has a summit coming up in 2022, I believe, and I imagine on that agenda is going to be a new strategic concept, and how will the war in the Ukraine shape that?
I think they're very challenged, Professor Schultz. As we sit here today, I'm in Brussels. The deputy chargés, the deputy chiefs of mission for the 30 allies are meeting in a sort of drafting committee working on that strategic concept right now. The first drafts of it have been around for some time. There's been a lot of different input from sources inside, outside government. But the problem is the facts on the ground in Ukraine keep changing. And that means that the implications for the strategic concept keep changing, particularly in terms of end games and sort of the definition and cost of a new NATO defensive posture. I mean, where we started after Ukraine 2014 with the Donbass and the Crimea aspects of this continuing war was a NATO that sort of woke up and said the post-Cold War dividend isn't as available as we thought. So NATO not only committed to things like increased defense spending, but really for the first time, beyond just getting brigades that could get somewhere in a week, agreed to put battalions forward in the 3 Baltic states and Poland. And their assignment was to be ready to fight tonight. The rules of engagement didn't require them to go back to the knack. They were supposed to close to the sound of the guns, literally, if Russia had come across the line in the last several years into NATO territory and engaged. So, NATO was already at a posture in battalion strength forward, sort of like the brigade was in Berlin during the Cold War. These were tripwire forces. It costs more than a peace posture, but still it's a long ways from the multi-divisional corps stacked north to south along some central line in Europe. So the huge question for NATO as it writes that strategic concept is, given that, as you pointed out, Secretary Austin has made clear, at least the Pentagon view, that there's going to be a Russia that's going to be weakened. How weakened? That's one of the unknowables. So I would imagine that at a minimum, NATO is going to want to have brigades now forward, and not just in the 3 Baltic countries and Poland, but they've already moved to put these enhanced forward presence battalions into Romania and Bulgaria along the Black Sea. So I would imagine you would sort of have brigade strength forces forward north to south from the Baltics down to the bottom of the Black Sea. And that will require defense investment. That's one of the reasons why the Germans have just approved a 100 billion euro plus up, why Denmark's agreed to go to 2% by 2030, because everyone knows it's going to cost money. I think they'll be able to get consensus probably on something that's at brigade strength forward as opposed to battalions, but not divisions. The real challenge, though, in the strategic concept is going to be the sort of the what then question. Is the strategy indefinitely going forward containment 2.0? Or are there still allies that will press for selective engagement in the hope that Putin might moderate, or the post-Putin regime might be receptive to try to find some form of cooperation? In other words, is NATO digging in for containment 2.0 for the long haul, decades? Or do we sort of need a show of enhanced strength that then enables a position to approach Russia and see if they want to sort of renounce in some way aggression and make reparation by some means for what they've done? Of course, all of that's impossible until you know the end of the war, and we don't know the end of the war. What we've seen so far is US strategy sort of reacting to events on the ground, still sort of searching for a narrative that lets it all come together. We started sort of with this, I mean, we've sort of reached for historical analogies to try to put this conflict into terms that we can comprehend and address. So we started on an assumption it was going to be blitzkrieg, that Kyiv might fall in 2 days. And everyone knew what that historical analogy was. That turned out to be completely wrong. The intelligence community was right that there was going to be an invasion. They were wrong about the Ukrainians' credible capacity to fight back. Then we sort of got fixed on Mariupol, and the analogy was the Alamo. Now, this heroic brigade holding out in the steel plant and hopelessly outnumbered, but buying time for Ukraine to assemble counteroffensive forces in the north and northeast and maybe march to victory, just as we did or just as the Texicans did in Texas after the Alamo. Now we're in another historical analogy, I think, watching this battle of Severodonetsk, and it's probably Verdun. We're sort of telling ourselves, yes, Russians are throwing everything at Severodonetsk at huge cost, and they'll probably take the city, but they're bleeding themselves white. And the Ukrainians can then counteroffense in the north and at Kharkiv, and maybe even Kherson in the south, and restore the status quo ante February 24th. But we don't know. We're at day 99. As Zelensky just said, the Ukrainian army is suffering 100 soldiers killed a day, which is a phenomenal number. Is the staying power there? So the main lesson I would take away, other than never underestimate Putin's ability to be brutal and ruthless as a KGB guy, and to the extent you can avoid sort of the piecemeal ratcheting up of sanctions and military assistance, the sooner you can throw real pain on Putin, the better. The last lesson that I would take away, because this was your test question, what are the lessons we've learned? The third lesson is that there are more lessons to come. We don't know all the answers yet.
Well, and you know, Bob, as I watch this and I think about historical analogies also, the one that comes to my mind is Nuremberg. See? Because the war crimes here are very real. And in fact, I'm surprised that some of these NGOs who are very good at using GeoInt and open source intelligence haven't started a virtual Nuremberg. So how this ends has ramifications in terms of human rights and war crimes that also are going to have to be addressed. And I just don't know how the Russian regime can be given any wiggle room because of this. But I'm also a realist, so I've seen those kinds of outcomes. But I'm going to stop. Arik, you're going to field questions, and at 1:20, I'm going to have to scoot, but I'll be here till then. Arik, do you want to start with the questions?
Sure. So for those of you who have a question, please type it into the chat, or you can raise your hand on Zoom and I will call on you if you'd like to speak and say your question out loud. So the first question comes from Doug Aronson, and he asks, can you discuss how Putin is able to keep domestic support despite the sanctions affecting the oligarchs and regular citizens in Russia? Ariel, perhaps you can take this?
Your mic's on. Your mic's off.
Here we go. Excellent question. Thank you. I monitor not just Russian social media, but specifically the Telegram channels. That is the last remaining semi-free media in Russia. There's a lot of chatter on that. What I found, and Arik, correct me if you have a different opinion, what I found on the Russian Telegram chats is that all available public opinion polls, be it pro-government or independent like Levada, suggest the support, of course. I've been doing public opinion research for a living for 8 years when I was young. So it all depends how you structure it, where you go, do you use a phone? Imagine somebody calls you, 10 o'clock in the evening and say, do you support President Putin and his war of liberation in Ukraine and a special military operation? Of course, you're going to say yes, or otherwise, as Aunt Lydia says, there will be consequences. But 60 to 80%, I think this is a safe assessment of 60 to 80% now. That doesn't mean that in a year, 2, 3 years, we don't know how long the sanctions are going to be imposed, the economic situation will deteriorate, the unemployment will go up, the goods and services that the Russians were accustomed to consume in the last 30 years of openness to the West, that is going to shut down. People in the industry will be pissed off because they cannot get all the technology, the investment, and the management expertise they were using so far. The BMWs, the ExxonMobils, the BPs, etc., are leaving Russia. The Chinese and the Indian market for Russian oil is limited, and the discount is 30 to 35%. So the situation as Russia long-term is going to deteriorate. And the support, as I remember as a young lad doing research on the Russian public opinion support of the war in Afghanistan, we just plot it year after year and it goes down. So we need to persevere in our sanctions. The Western resolve is a strategic factor to change the viewpoint, not just of Mr. Putin, but of those in Russia, including in his entourage, who understand that Putin just destroyed single-handedly 300 plus years of Russian openness and cooperation and competition with the West, and he is turning Russia into a new North Korea, much bigger, maybe colder and nastier, but still a North Korea, and they see it as a dead end.
If I could just have a two-finger tack on to Ariel's point, and I agree with almost everything that you said. I would just put in a caveat, which is that obviously there's state propaganda and so on. It's not possible unless you're a sophisticated resident of Moscow or St. Petersburg who knows how to operate a VPN. And of course, VPN usage shot up tremendously.
And it's under pressure now to be shut down.
Yes, and a lot of things are being shut down, but this is a double-edged sword. And I think what you pointed out is the long-term nature of this. And the question that I have is, how long is that until the economy starts to turn south and that actually has an effect? Because even if there is an effect, it's not automatic that the support for the regime will crumble. You know, the old Chinese adage of, kill one, scare 10,000. I think the regime has been extremely proficient in doing that, as we've seen with Mr. Navalny and his supporters. Their narrative is that the West is out to get us and has been since forever. And the really pernicious, and I think in some ways effective, thing about Mr. Putin and his regime's propaganda is that there is always a kernel of truth to some extent in what he says. And we saw this in the election interference in our election in 2016, and our committee did a long report on that is mostly publicly available. I invite you to take a look at that. But especially, his main audience is not the Republican Party in the United States or the Democrats. If you remember, they had advertisements that they actually staged a rally somewhere in Texas, I think, with Antifa on one side and the, ultra right-wing gun folks on the other side, and they were shouting at each other until they realized that nobody, had organized that, and it was organized out of St. Petersburg. But the main audience is in Russia. And unfortunately, as companies like McDonald's and telecoms and all reputable Western companies pull out, which is much farther than I think Western governments were prepared to go when this whole thing started, Russians increasingly see themselves targeted because they're Russian. And the more like, conductors, and rightly so in the case of Georgiev, but the more, you can't have Russian teams participate in Western sporting events, which is as it should be. But
Russian cats in the cat show.
Russian cats in the cat show. The regime propaganda has very successfully, and I'm afraid they're going to continue to be successful in this, has posited this to mean they've been out to get Russia because of who we are. Similarly to, I think, some arguments made by American politicians. They hate us because of our freedom. Well, no, not necessarily. But this line has the kernel of truth. He says, hey, it's not we who are attacking, it's we who are defending. We're under attack. We've had 5 rounds of NATO expansion since the end of the Cold War. They've got the Baltics. What else do they need? Now, Ukraine, the heart of Russian civilization, in their telling, right? With Kyiv, the mother of all Russian cities, is under attack. And if you remember the speech that Putin gave in Crimea in 2014, it was a powerful speech. And it appealed, I think, to the Russian psyche. And it had some of these, distorted, but things that, if you're not really a political expert or an expert on disinformation or polling, you're looking at this and in Novosibirsk, and you're going, there's some kernel of truth to that. Why should these things be happening? And unfortunately, the timeline for the public opinion to change in light of the propaganda, in light of the repressive measures that the regime is still very capable of employing, is unfortunately very long. And I would posit that Mr. Putin is counting on exactly what you said, Ariel, the unity in the West. We almost had a presidential, almost successful presidential candidate in France, who's took loans from a bank in Moscow, Ms. Le Pen. You have Viktor Orban. You have NATO and the EU are two security and governance institutions that operate exclusively by consensus. And the pain is not only going to be felt in Russia, it's being felt right now in the gas pump in the US. And I worry that, even by the end of this year, but certainly if this lasts beyond a year into the next election cycle, you're not going to have, and the news from Ukraine fades from the front pages. There's an expiration date. I'm sorry that this sounds blunt, but there's an expiration date in public opinion in the West and especially in the United States If this wasn't at the top of the headlines, we wouldn't know about it, we wouldn't care about it, and we wouldn't do anything about it. And so it's a cynical viewpoint, but it's a real danger.
Yeah, and I mean, we've heard the term Russophobia coming from Russian media for many years, but I think especially in the past few months, they've been using it more and more often, trying to feed this narrative that Russia is a kind of besieged fortress, constantly fending off attacks from the West. And Mike and Ariel, as you both said, the sanctions really feed into this narrative too, that the West is out to get Russia. Oleg, you have your hand up.
Thank you. It's an amazing discussion. I'm wondering if the panel could also talk about G20, because I think for Russia, it's an important venue that sort of legitimizes them and corroborates to many of the points that their propaganda makes and that the panel made.
So who would like to take that question?
I can maybe make a very short stab and leave it to others to finish this one. So G20 is not my area of expertise. I'm deep on Russia and Europe and that part of the world, and more wide on the rest of the world. But I kind of alluded to it in terms of the global food and commodity prices. And as we saw from some of the UN votes that initially came right in the beginning of the war, this is really an important issue for now in the United States and in Europe. There is a lot more sympathy for the Russian point of view in India, certainly in China, in the global South, in countries that are dependent on Russian and Ukrainian wheat exports, potash exports. And we saw Indonesia, right, invite Mr. Putin to the G20, at which point the US said that we would boycott. And so there's not global unanimity on this issue, because I think the stakes are a lot different in Europe and across the Atlantic than they are in countries that are more dependent and could see severe food shortages and instability. And, is this Mr. Putin's fault? Absolutely. Is this a weapon that he's going to use? Absolutely.
To me, this is very much like the Cold War, where every forum, every country is becoming a diplomatic and security, intelligence, and potential military battlefield. I'm old enough to remember why Ethiopia, Somalia, Angola, Mozambique, Nicaragua, El Salvador, etc., were important. Similarly, Indonesia has an agenda. We have good diplomats. We can send them there to figure out what does it take to keep Putin out of there. I'm more worried about Malaysia, that stated that they're going to supply Russia with microchips. Russia has a real problem. They did not get their industry to produce microchips, and we heard reports that microchips that originally were destined for washing machines and fridges went into the Russian BMPs and tanks. More power to them. The Chinese are very cautious not to be hit with our sanctions if they provide military-grade microchips to Russia. So I was talking to my colleague Dan Fried, former Assistant Secretary of State, who was the sanctions coordinator during the Obama administration, and said, Dan, after 2014 invasion of Ukraine, we need to resuscitate COCOM. And COCOM was a Western organization to keep strategic and dual-use technologies out of the Russian hands. And Dan said, we do not want to go to the Cold War, quote unquote. Well, shoot, we are in the Cold War version 2.0. We need to limit any and all military and dual use technologies going to Russia. I want to step, just if you allow me, Arik, just a step back about the support. First of all, as I pointed out, while even a neutral or non-government poll may say 60% support or 80% support, people are afraid to talk to the pollsters. I would be if I were a Russian. So you need to be much more sophisticated, and I haven't seen polling data that suggested that level of sophistication, as I mentioned in the tail end of the Cold War, as a young researcher I was involved in. And secondly, sanctioning Russian musicians, Russian cats in the cat show, or Russian scientists may be a step too far. On the contrary, as we did during the Cold War, to highlight those who oppose the war, give them ability to emigrate, work with them in the war of ideas dimension that I think we're not using very much. Our Voice of America, our international broadcasting is weak. Its penetration in Russia is not terrific. We barely have a government-supported efforts on Telegram, which, as I mentioned, is the only social media left because Facebook, Twitter, etc., is shut down, and the only way to penetrate Russia today is on the Russian-controlled social media like Vkontakte and others. We need a mobilization in the war of ideas and social media, but this is the drum I was beating during the anti-jihad war since 9/11, and there's a very limited success in the US government, and especially in the Pentagon, who still thinks that all solutions are kinetic.
Thank you both. There's another question from Adolfo Gatti, who asks that maintaining sanctions will be extremely painful for European countries, especially those dependent on Russian natural gas. In the meantime, there will be important national elections across the West. What is the United States doing to encourage its allies to be in this for the long term? Mike, do you want to take this?
Sure, I've got a motorcade in the background, so I was hoping to wait until they passed, but I'll take a stab. I mean, obviously, you know, we're in the Congress. We kind of are not always in the room where it happens. We see reflections somewhat. Obviously, the you know, the State Department and DoD are in the lead. You know, you have the monthly contact group that Secretary Austin has initiated. You have obviously the shuttle diplomacy that Tony Blinken is undertaking. You know, but we've been in touch on the Hill over here, you know, with the Swedes and Finns. We had the Swedish defense minister come through, the Finnish foreign minister, you know, delegations from their opposition parties. You know, everybody in the Nordics, and Sweden and Finland is, you know, they went from 25% support joining NATO to 70 support. And it's a good question. I mean, you know, I'm sure everybody's read those stories about, you know, the thinking of Mr. Putin for why this would be a particularly good idea at this particular time. And it included everything from the US withdrawal from Afghanistan to the upcoming election of, you know, Macron versus Le Pen, to Angela Merkel leaving the political scene, to the sky-high gas prices that the Europeans were already suffering under this winter. And there are all those stories about how German households moved to, you know, those old wood-burning stoves. And it is a really good question, because, there's been some really creative thinking about import substitution, various deals reached by the Germans with Middle Eastern countries for liquid natural gas and, buying back from other pipelines. And I'm not a gas and oil expert, so somebody will probably correct me on something that I've said. But to me, it seems like, right now what's happening is everybody's chasing those same alternate sources. We don't have the capacity to export those resources from the United States, unlike what the Republican talking points are. This isn't because Biden isn't authorizing drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Reserve or supporting the Colonial Pipeline. It's because there's a real reluctance among companies to pump up production, which you may not need 6 months down the road, and they're going to face financial losses. So it's not clear to me. That's a really good question. It's not clear where those substitutions are going to come to for the European energy needs, at least in the short run, right? They need reprocessing facilities in Germany to import liquid natural gas. There's just a story in the Times about an entire company town, whose name eludes me now, in East Germany, where the whole town business is based on refining Russian crude, and the capabilities in that plant are not suited for other types of crude because of the specificities of the Russian crude. And there's some nascent efforts to include green power in that power plant, but this is all a long way off. And it reminds me of the speech that Putin, gave some years ago. It was very kind of smarmy. And he had this, I think it was after Crimea, he had kind of this like half smile that he has. And he said, well, the Europeans get rid of nuclear power. They don't want to buy our oil. What are they going to do? Heat their houses with wood? Well, we're the ones with the forests of Siberia too. And so obviously this is a card that he knows how to play and has played it in the past and will continue to play it. And again, I'm going to go back to my point of there is an expiration date here and a timeline. And although, there's some great battlefield successes that Ukraine has seen, and the exertions are really something and inspiring, I think, for Europeans and Americans who haven't fought for our liberty for 80 years. But at some point, I don't know that they're going to be able to continue this ad infinitum. There's going to be there's a lack of sustainment. And I'm an optimist usually, but I'm also in the intelligence business. And so most of the time, I guess not usually, most of the time I'm a pessimist. But my boss always asks me where the good news and funny stories are in the intelligence business.
Well, so I have a question. Mike mentioned Sweden and Finland. This is for Robert. What do you think are the implications of Finland and Sweden joining NATO for European security? And what are the prospects now for other countries like Ukraine or Georgia to join NATO?
Well, in terms of implications, I think there are three that are pretty clear, Eric. The first is at sort of the strategic geopolitical level. It's a huge setback for Putin, who set out to try to roll NATO back and sort of shut the door to further enlargements, to have these two highly capable Nordic nations conclude that they really need to come in and come in fast. Second, it provides NATO in terms of the collective defense pool that NATO can draw on when they allocate capability targets and define missions and force structures. These are not, this is not Montenegro and Albania or North Macedonia. These are extremely capable militaries of significant size with very strong industrial base as well. And then third, in a very sort of tactical sense, it provides strategic depth to the Baltics, which have been exposed in the north, and concern over the last many years about Russian capacity to cut them off across the Suwalki Gap and sort of dare NATO to see if it could spend a year to build up to take them back. This provides some strategic depth to the NATO challenge of defending in the north. So it's good, assuming that the Turkish issues can be resolved. I personally think they will, but it's not for sure, particularly if President Erdogan insists on concrete actions that go beyond sort of statements of intent. If he takes hostage the official invitation to changes in Swedish law, the Swedish popular opinion is swung dramatically, but there's probably some point where Swedes really start getting a little annoyed at Turkey's ability to dictate their domestic policy. So it needs to be resolved and resolved soon. Now, in terms of what the implications for other countries, I don't think they're particularly significant. Of course, NATO can say that it's had, we have an open door policy, and we proved it over and over again. Montenegro, North Macedonia, now Sweden, now Finland. So you guys that are still out there, Ukraine, Georgia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, whoever, don't give up hope. It is possible, but I'm not sure that it demonstrably changes the consensus, or more precisely, the lack of consensus across NATO's 30 members today about admitting Ukraine, Georgia, or Bosnia Herzegovina into the alliance.
Thank you. I actually have another question for Ariel, and this is to think about some of the second order security implications for the region from the weakening of Russian forces. How will this impact Eurasian security broadly? How might diminished Russian military presence in places like the South Caucasus, Central Asia, and Syria create power vacuums, and who might fill them?
Well, if I were a Russian national security advisor, Putin, the thing I would keep me up at night, and I would be really concerned about, is the Taliban or ISIS Khorasan, Afghanistan, attack on Tajikistan, because what divides Tajikistan from an Islamic invasion and collapse is the thin red line of the 201st Russian military base. It's a brigade, essentially 5,000 people there. And I do not know how many people ISIS can mobilize, but we know that ISIS Khorasan is fighting on and off the government in Kabul, the Taliban government. And I don't think the Taliban government is interested or willing to invade Tajikistan now. But I was in Tashkent in July of last year. I talked to all the representatives of these countries, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and others. And there is a real threat of destabilization in Central Asia. That's one. Two, if I was a Russian general staff guy, would I really be interested in taking all my conventional troops, infantry, etc., off the Chinese border and just deploying them in Ukraine and get a lot of them slaughtered? I'm not so sure. For now, I do not think there is a threat to Russian proxies in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and the Armenians demonstrated that they're fully in the Russian grip. But you know what? I think Russia is losing Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan used Bayraktars against Armenia. The relationship with Turkey seems to be tighter and tighter. President Aliyev was in Moscow, just signed some paperwork and keeping Putin off his back, but they're not joining the Eurasian Economic Union. So slowly, I think they're weakening along the periphery. And I will venture a guess. If Russia is decisively defeated in Ukraine, even Chechnya may consider the third round of fighting with or without the Kadyrov's leadership. Finally, I would say, as I'm asking in my Newsweek piece that is supposed to come out either this week or in the beginning of next week, who thought that a KGB lieutenant general would achieve the following strategic achievements? Drag his army into what's for many is humiliating military performance in Ukraine, get Finland and Sweden joining NATO, pull out most of his troops from Syria. They keep the bases, but a lot of other locations were transferred already to the pro-Iranian militias and potentially giving Israel more freedom of action against the Iranian targets. So overall, I think Putin is demonstrating the grand strategy failure. So Dick, it's not just a Potemkin military, it's a Potemkin grand strategy.
Mhm.
I hate comparisons to Hitler, but one reason Germany lost World War II is because of the grand strategy failure of Hitler. It's not because the German ground forces were not spectacular. There were very good ground forces, soldiers, but getting the British Empire, US, and the Soviet Union fighting you at the same time was a big, big failure. And I'm just hoping that Putin is making miscalculations on that scale.
You know,
One-
Ariel, I mean,
Go ahead.
it looks like he is. And
Inshallah, as they say in
yeah, I mean,
Brooklyn.
he's made some tremendous miscalculations. And I think he also believed that his military was much more capable than it is. You know, and it's not just the problem of conscripts, it's the problem of logistics and the corruption in the logistics system that's been amazing. And the fact that and Mike mentioned this, their inability to adopt modern command and control concepts is really staggering. And so, you know, what do? They move all these generals to the front, and they're sitting ducks.
And another thing that is fascinating is to watch China. China is doing lessons learned very fast. The Chinese did not perform in accordance to the 5,000 word Sino-Russian Brotherhood memorandum, the Olympic memorandum, I think it's February 4th, that was terrific on paper, but in terms of economic assistance, in terms of military technology supply, the Russians ask for shells and missiles, and the Chinese are not giving them. And I'm not so sure.
Think, you know, I think
the Chinese
China,
are not giving the chips, the military grade chips.
Well,
yeah.
I think China is looking at Russia and thinking, you know, what kind of ally is this that we've signed up with?
Or a target for further economic and maybe not just economic expansion in the Far East and Siberia, because that's a vacuum, and vacuum, is an interesting thing for an expanding power.
No, that's right.
Just a quick point I wanted to make on this. You guys covered a lot of ground there, but on China, they obviously still find Russia useful to push back against U.S. unipolarity, but their support is not unconditional love, if I can put it that way. But I wanted Lieutenant Colonel of the KGB, not Lieutenant General.
Oh, I'm sorry, I misspoke. Yeah, of course, of course.
One of the points that I would make, though, is, if you recall the war in Chechnya, I highly recommend, by the way, for everybody watching this, I don't know if you follow War on the Rocks. I don't do it that often, but Michael Kaufman, who I have a lot of respect for in terms of his analysis of the Russian military, has some very cogent analysis, and he actually called the invasion before it happened. Obviously, so did our intelligence community, as we put out, we, the United States, publicly before this whole thing kicked off. That's something that hasn't been mentioned in terms of kind of throwing Putin on the back foot by saying, hey, by the way, here's your plan. It's 100,000 plus soldiers from 7 directions. They're going to take Kyiv. And then, of course, the Russians went ahead, instead of changing their plan, went ahead and did exactly that plan, which kind of shows you, the level of at least operational thinking and command and control. Again, to that point, I wanted to raise a very, very quick and short point on Russian influence on its periphery. And that's Kazakhstan, which I think is a really interesting case, because if everybody remembers, before it was knocked off the headlines, we had the protests / riots / potential coup attempt in Almaty at the beginning of the year. It was a very interesting episode because I kind of watched it closely because my wife happens to be from that city originally. But if you remember, it started off with these kind of gas riots, but then when it came down to riots in the capital, the police were nowhere to be found. And it was only after Mr. Tokayev called Putin and asked him to send in the cavalry that the police and the security services reappeared, started firing indiscriminately into the crowds, and essentially took control of the situation there. So essentially, Tokayev owes Putin his presidency, without which it probably would have gone to, whether it was, one of Nazarbayev's sons-in-law or whatever that was about. Basically, as soon as the Russians sent the airborne brigade, everybody fell back into line. The security forces appeared. The situation was stabilized. I remember, we somewhat crowingly, Antony Blinken kind of made that point about like, well, don't invite the Russians into your house. They may never leave. Well, they left like 2 weeks later. But it's also very interesting and showing that Tokayev, when Putin asked for assistance after he invaded Ukraine, they kind of said, thanks, but no thanks. They've been able to stage some kind of, even though it's a repressive government, some kind of mild demonstrations in downtown, Almaty and Astana that have been sanctioned. They allow propaganda Russian channels to appear in Kazakhstan. And it kind of does show that at least, there are tangible effects in the weakening of Russian influence on its periphery. So something to watch. I think it's a really interesting question. Thank you for asking it.
I think 2 other places that are interesting to observe include Moldova and the Black Sea. Ariel, perhaps you can share some thoughts that you have on the future of Russian forces there.
Well, thank you. I think throughout the post-Soviet space, as I discussed in my book, and it was a dissertation that Professor Schultz was on the committee, I said at the time, and I think it was correct at the time and now, if you are a local elite in Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and elsewhere, you would rather be a local minister, ambassador, president, prime minister, or head of the security services than a cipher in a machine run from Moscow. And this is where the independence drive and mistrust of the Russians comes from. The republics that were most pro-Russian, such as Belarus or Armenia, still do not want to relinquish their independence. And of course, when the Russian tanks rolling in, telling the Ukrainians, you're not Ukrainians, you're little Russians, Malorossi, and you're not Ukraine, you're Malorossia, you're little Russia. The Ukrainians pick up the guns. Ukrainians who are ethnic Russians, ethnic Ukrainians, of course, Jews, Tatars, Crimean Tatars, or Georgians who live there. Everybody in a rubber duck, Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers. So back to Moldova, Moldova is split, essentially. I did some consulting work on Moldova. The people in power now, Maya Sandu, the president, is Kennedy School graduate, pro-Western, English-speaking lady. Those who voted for President Dadon for the Socialist Party are pro-Russian. Moldova finally is shutting down Russian TV channels. So they're split. The concern is that in Transnistria, the secessionist territory, which is part of Moldova by law, there are Russian troops, Russian military warehouses, and Russian-speaking population that I can see easily is calling for another brigade or two to land in Tiraspol and then attack Chisinau. Moldova has pretty much zero military capacity. What Moldova could do, and we're not there yet, is have a referendum and join Romania. Then Moldova is in NATO, the language is the same, the ethnicity is more or less the same, and then we have an expanded Romania, then NATO will or will not protect against the Russian aggression. So watch it. It is interesting. It is potentially dangerous. And the other thing they could do, if they fly the troops and land the troops in Transnistria, those troops can attack Ukraine from the west and march to Odessa, which is what, like 90 clicks away from the Transnistria border.
So just on the Black Sea, just one note, Eric. One of the real surprises of this war has been the extent to which the Russian naval force out of Crimea has been so ineffective. And from the original concern that an amphibious force could take Odessa backed with fire support from the Moskva cruiser, the Ukrainians' extraordinary ability to not only sink ships, but basically push the Russian naval operations back out of coastal anti-ship missile range has been a huge factor in this war. And with Denmark's provision now of Harpoon missiles to Ukraine, it's even going to be a stronger effect. But what you're seeing now is sort of people looking at the Black Sea, not in terms of military engagement lens, but in terms of the grain export issue. And that has tempted Macron and Scholz to try to engage Putin to open up sea corridors. And of course, Putin, being clever, has said, sure, if the Ukrainians will take all the mines out from around Odessa, which I can't see the Ukrainians doing. So I don't think that initiative is going to go anywhere. So we're probably where we are now. It's thanks to Turkey, of course, that the Dardanelles are closed to Russia in terms of reinforcement of the fleet from Crimea. So it's a wasting asset getting smaller. And I think we just sort of have to accept that that's the best on offer and resist initiatives to open the Black Sea in the name of grain exports.
Great. Well, we have just a couple of minutes left. Does anyone have final thoughts? Perhaps I can start with Mike.
Well, we've wasted, as you guys up in Boston may remember, if folks were around there and listened to NPR and click and clack on NPR, we've wasted a perfectly good hour and a half. And unfortunately, we're no longer, or we're no closer to an answer to my central questions, which are Petraeus's question about Iraq, which is how does this end? And that's something that is very much on my mind in terms of, it's a very, obviously this is a tragedy for Ukraine and for the Ukrainian people. It's a tragedy, for frankly, the Russian conscripts that are, being sent into a meat grinder. It's a tragedy for, the people dependent on grain from this region. We're going to see slow rolling effects of that. It could have all been avoided, with different leadership in Moscow. But this is also something which has been on the slow roll trajectory, I'd say, since the end of the Cold War. I recall my time in Moscow in '95. One of the images that I take away with me from that time, when I was building democracy with NDI there, and we did so well that I went to Fletcher and studied security studies with Dr. Schultz, and went into the intelligence business instead of the democracy development business.
That was smart.
But well, yeah, I kind of saw the writing on the wall there. But one of the things that I remember from that period was these Russian conscripts in '95 in the middle of Moscow, begging for spare change with cap in hand. And I mean, I think these are some of the things that propelled Putin. I think there's a lot of, again, who was it that said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I think there were people warning at that time about Russian revanchism and comparing Russia to Weimar. I think everybody was looking at Zhirinovsky, who thankfully has, left for
The Russian ship.
different with the Russian ship. That's right.
But if you remember Galina Starovoitova talking about 1990s, she wrote a book called Weimar Russia. She was killed. She was a democratic politician woman.
And I think that the parallels are closer probably than we realize in terms of, the Versailles and the reparations and the period that Russia went through with privatizatsiya, right? It was called, where you had the oligarchs come out ahead, and the weakness of Yeltsin, and longing for a great power status, just like the German people had in the 30s. And frankly, for most of his career, Putin did pretty well in terms of, right, he had the bargain of economic growth, and if you leave politics alone, and that seemed to work out okay. But he developed his own megalomania and thoughts about half-formed thoughts about history, and Peter the Great and Catherine now is reenacting that with the people of Ukraine. And I guess I lost the central thought of the point that I was making, but I worry about how this ends, because I don't see him giving up what he started, regardless of the military support that we send to Ukraine. I see the clock ticking in Kiev with the economy in shambles, the horrendous refugee crisis, the 60 to 100 soldiers, brave soldiers a day that are dying. And I only see this thing continuing. And that is probably the best case scenario, because the worst case scenario is exactly what the US policy has been, which is to force a Russian defeat on land. And to my mind, there's only one logical outcome if that happens, which is that Putin will extend the war. He will have both horizontal and vertical escalation in terms of either, broadening it to some other place like Moldova. I mean, I think that's less likely now, but certainly in terms of vertical escalation inside Ukraine, I see, victims here in the Ukrainian population. And I frankly think that, they're, and I don't know if it's possible, but certainly in terms of diplomacy, I have not seen any effort on the part of the United States to get out ahead of this. The only efforts that we've seen are kind of these spasmodic efforts by Erdogan and France and Germany, which haven't really led anywhere. But I worry that the longer it continues, the harder it will be to stop, the worse it will be for Ukraine, the more unstable it will be with second and third order effects. and the risk to ultimately escalation, as well as, as we saw during the Cuban Missile Crisis, you have a plane stray over the wrong border, you have a ship that's armed with nuclear capable cruise missiles, as the Moskva is designed to be. Thankfully, it wasn't. But you have some real potential for unintended consequences, miscalculation. And I know my Ukrainian friends that are on this call is like, well, how much further could he escalate? What is he going to do? Invade Ukraine? And my heart goes out to all of you guys, but there has to be, I hope that there is a different outcome than the one that I think that we are heading towards.
Thank you. And thank you to all the panelists. That's all the time we have. I wish we could continue this conversation.
I apologize for that long monologue.
No, well, I really appreciate all of your insights. And Oleg, thank you for co-organizing this event and the previous two events in our series of conversations with Fletcher and Harvard alumni. We will, of course, be watching the war in Ukraine closely and hope for peace to come as soon as possible. Aleph, do you want to say a couple of words?
Just two fingers. The peace will come after the Ukrainian victory.
Okay. Thank you, Ariel. Aleph, any final thoughts?
It's a profound, deep discussion. What amazes me is that the three discussions that we organized are very, very different. The points of view are very different, from humanitarian crisis to economy and world energy market to now security aspects. All of those topics are fascinating, and I cannot think of a better venue than the Fletcher. Thank you very much, and I hope we will continue with this, and also with the involvement of alumni in this type of exchanges. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. And that concludes our series.